And now we have another speaker from Yellowstone, Derek Goldman. Welcome. Thank you. You have you're the Northern Rocky Mountain representative for the Endangered Species Coalition, and you educate the public and decision makers about the threatened and endangered wildlife. And I also know that you've been a professional river guide.
Yeah, that's correct. And is this on? Yeah.
Yes.
And I live in western Montana, close to the border of Montana and Idaho, so right smack in the middle of wolf and grizzly bear country.
Wonderful. Just when you mention Yellowstone, people go, ah. Yeah. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's Yellowstone. It's a big magnet.
Okay,
so.
Wonderful. So the stage is yours. Case Yellowstone.
Great, thank you. So once again, I'm with an organization, an NGO in the United States, a small organization called the Endangered Species Coalition. And we work to educate both the public as well as decision makers on the importance of protecting endangered species and the importance of strong laws to protect endangered species, which I'll talk about, and also to protect their habitat. So today, let's see if I can make this work here. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about a little bit, mostly I'm going to focus on wolves today and the case of wolf recovery in the greater Yellowstone region over the last decade and a half, and what some of the challenges we've seen around wolf recovery, which turn out, I'll get to this, but it turns out it's not biological, it's more political. And then I'll talk about some of the ecotourism opportunities that have emerged and how wolves have helped that in the area. And then just some of the things we've learned from that and some lessons and things we would do to move forward. So mostly, you know, what I do is I've worked on wolf advocacy for much of my time for the last 3 years that I've been with the coalition. I've been 6 years with the Endangered Species Coalition, but because the wolf issue became very controversial and heated within the last 5 years as wolf populations grew, that's where I spend a lot of my time. So just for a little bit of background, this gray area here is the entire historic range of where the gray wolf used to live in North American continent, but you know, by the early to mid part of the 20th century, it was pretty much relegated to just the northern areas. And you can see here in just these two places in the United States, this is the Canadian border, is where we have wolves now. And this is, I live right there. This is the state of Montana. And this corner right here, it's kind of hard to see, of northwestern Wyoming is Yellowstone National Park. And we have a law on the books that was passed in 1973 called the Endangered Species Act. And it turns out the Endangered Species Act was very important to the history of wolves in the United States, because the law not only requires the federal government to protect species that are likely to go extinct in the foreseeable future, but the law requires the government to protect their habitat and work to recover the species as well. So because of the Endangered Species Act, a plan was written in the 1980s, and that plan included a reintroduction program for wolves in this area. And so this, at the time the wolf was listed under the Endangered Species Act, this is the only place where we had wolves in the United States. But since then, these are some of the areas where wolves have been reintroduced and where ongoing recovery is happening. There's basically 4 subspecies of wolf. The northern Rocky Mountain gray wolf here. This is the timber wolf in the upper Midwest. This is a wolf called the Carolina red wolf. And then this is the Mexican gray wolf, otherwise known as the lobo. But my talk is just going to focus on this recovery area for the northern Rocky Mountain region right now. And We now, as of the last count, we have about between 1,500 and 2,000 wolves now in this area. And that is a result of the population growth that happened from these reintroductions. So in 1995 was the first reintroduction where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service brought 14 captured wolves from Canada, and they reintroduced them right here in Yellowstone National Park. And then also the second area of reintroduction was right in the middle of central Idaho, and they brought 15 wolves there. And then the next year they supplemented each of those populations with additional introductions of 17 and 20 wolves. And so since then it's been really successful, and you can see the population growth rate in wolves in this region. And just to make up for Fran's lack of graphs, I'll have a lot of graphs in my presentation. So yeah. So this is the central Idaho recovery area, and this is Yellowstone, the greater Yellowstone area. So you can see it's really grown exponentially. And like I said, that's really the easy part of wolf recovery, because they're wolves, they're dogs. They have lots of litters of puppies every year, and they're habitat generalists. They can really live anywhere. They just need not to be shot at, really, to thrive. Unlike some other species that are more of a challenge to recover, like grizzly bears and lynx and wolverine, where they have low, in the case of bears, they have low reproductive rates. A female grizzly bear only gives birth to about 2 or 3 cubs every 2 or 3 years. And of course, all those other species, the lynx and the wolverine and the bears, have much greater habitat challenges than the wolf does. And then today, here's where we are. All these circles represent individual packs of wolves as of last year. And so you can kind of see where the great density of wolves around Yellowstone, which is right there. And then this is Glacier National Park, and the only thing I'll say about this is this is where wolves were starting to recolonize this area at the time of the reintroductions in Idaho and Yellowstone. So wolves were already starting to come back into this area from Canada. And then I just want to talk a little bit about some of the ecological benefits that we've seen with the restoration of the wolf in the Northern Rockies, because it wasn't something that was expected or known at the time. But what we found out, and this is really recent science, and I think Franz mentioned it briefly, this concept of trophic cascades, where you have the influence of a carnivore like the wolf that actually has this ripple effect through the ecosystem. And for example, this top picture is a picture of in the Lamar Valley in Yellowstone National Park right after wolves were reintroduced, and you can see there's really no willow in this riparian zone here, and very little vegetation, and that's because the elk not only were the elk so abundant, but the elk were not afraid to just stand around and eat all the time, and they tend to congregate in the riparian zones along the streams. And so there was a complete absence of recruitment of young willows. And then here we are, what is this, 13 years later, and you can see how much willow has recolonized this riparian zone, where it's no longer a safe place for, now that there's wolves there, for the elk to just linger and eat all day. So the elk have to keep moving, and they have to keep watching, and the landscape has changed dramatically. And once you have more willows in the riparian zone, you end up with greater biodiversity, including more beavers and fish and amphibians and songbirds. And I just wanted to mention that because it's a lot of biologists are really astounded by what a big difference the addition of the wolf has made in Yellowstone National Park ecologically. But wolf recovery was not without its challenges. And this, especially in the last, I'd say the last 6 or 7 years, as the wolf numbers really started to get up into the higher numbers in the region. As you can imagine, there's people that live and have their livelihoods in the rural areas, and wolves are not an easy animal to live with. And it's gotten really heated, the discussion on wolves within the last few years, and as a result of that, the gray wolf in the northern Rockies actually this past year became the first species ever in the history of the Endangered Species Act that had to be removed by Congress. The politics here in the northern Rockies reached such a high level that it influenced all the way to the U.S. Congress in Washington, D.C., and Congress got involved in a wildlife decision and removed wolves from the protection of the Endangered Species Act. And now we have public hunting of gray wolves in Montana and Idaho, and we're soon to have it in Wyoming. I don't think it's going to be much of a problem if it's managed well. I think some other things could be a problem, such as trapping, but we have so many wolves, and it looks like it's going to be hard for hunters to actually hunt wolves. So we have two groups of people that are most unhappy with having lots of wolves, and one of them is the livestock owners, and we have lots of sheep and cattle in the region. And in spite of all that you hear, if you pick up the newspaper in Montana or Idaho, you read about a wolf killed a bunch of sheep. But when you actually look at all the data, the percentage of sheep and cattle that are actually lost to wolves are very small when you region-wide. The problem is that the small amount of wolves, or I'm sorry, the small amount of livestock that is lost to wolf attack is not necessarily spread out among all the livestock operators. So maybe there's just a few livestock producers that bear most of that burden. But the media likes to focus on stories about blood and wolf attacks, and they don't always tell the positive stories about the wolf. So that's my job. So we try to get the word out about the data that wolves really don't represent that much of a problem for the livestock producers, and there's also lots of solutions that are available for livestock producers, such as this netting here. This is called a flagery, and for some reason this started up in Canada, but these red flags that hang from this wire scare the wolves away. And then also having another thing is actually having a herder with these animals is even a bigger deterrent, because wolves are shy of people. But unfortunately, the model for raising livestock in the West has been you turn your sheep and cattle loose in the spring in the mountains, and then in the fall you go collect them. And it's not a very good or safe model for raising livestock. And then we also have some programs designed to compensate ranchers for livestock loss. It's not complete, but they do get some compensation, as well as there needs to be more money for prevention for some of these techniques. A bigger problem in recent years has been the sportsman. And once again, when you get down and you look at the data here, you see that the actual elk populations, in spite of what some of the more extreme sportsmen like to say, the wolf has not been the end of the elk. And you can see in 1994, we've had this many elk in the 3 states in the region when at the time wolves were reintroduced. And today there's actually 60% more elk in the 3 states combined. It's gone down a little bit in Idaho, but Wyoming and Montana has more than made up for it. So I'm not going to say that wolves don't result in a decline of ungulates in some areas. They do. They're certainly not vegetarians. Wolves eat meat, and they prey preferentially on elk. But it's not as that black and white of an issue. In some areas, wolves have contributed to a decline in elk populations, but they're not the only factor. And a bigger factor in those areas is the lack of habitat due to development, and also overhunting, frankly. And the hunters and the wildlife agencies don't often want to admit that overhunting has caused a decline of elk in some areas, so they blame it on the wolf. And then the other thing is, from the point of view of the individual hunter, since the wolf has been back, the hunter goes out and maybe he doesn't come home with an elk that year and jumps to the conclusion that wolves have eaten a lot of the elk, when in fact what we know that wolves have done is they've changed the behavior of elk on the landscape. The elk can no longer treat the wilderness as like a big ranch. They have to look out for predators now because there's a lot of wolves. So the elk are harder to find. They're more elusive, and they hide. So it's not as easy for hunters to hunt elk. And then mostly it's really about the politics, which is I could do a whole presentation on that, but it makes for good politics if you're a conservative politician in the western part of the United States to get to beat up on environmentalists. And if you can blame environmentalists and wolves, and the federal government in particular, I think was part of the problem is that the Endangered Species Act mandated that wolves be restored and brought into these areas. So you have a lot of people who didn't grow up with wolves around, and there's this sense that wolves were brought here and it was something that was done to us by the federal government, if you're one of those people that thinks that. But that's been my biggest challenge in recent years. The only other thing I'll say about that is in some cases wolves have also caused an increase in ungulate populations. For instance, we have antelope in Wyoming, and before the wolf came back, the antelope fawns were a large prey for coyotes. And since wolves have killed a lot of the coyotes because they're competitors, we now see an increase in the rate of fawn recruitment among certain antelope populations. So it's a mixed story. And now I'll talk about some of the ecotourism. As you can see, wildlife watching, it's the #1 outdoor recreational activity in the United States. And a large percentages of Americans get out and do it, even if it's just looking at wildlife around their house. But also a large percentage of Americans travel and go on visits to places like Yellowstone to view wildlife. It's a significant number of people. And just here's another thing from the Outdoor Industry Association that just shows of all the outdoor recreational activities how important wildlife watching is. And people come from all over the United States. In all regions, people are engaged in some sort of wildlife watching, either around their home or also traveling. There's no one particular area. It's pretty universal. And in fact, we also, and I'll talk about this, but we also have a lot of European visitors and Asian visitors who come to view wildlife. So here in my region, this is the annual visitation for Yellowstone National Park, and we don't have 2011 on this graph yet, but the new statistics just came out, and 2011 was also another record-setting year, just a little bit higher than 2010. So over almost 4 million people now every year that come to Yellowstone National Park. And incidentally, the best time of the year to see wolves is actually spring, winter, and fall rather than summer. So I think from the point of view of ecotourism, one of the benefits that the wolf has brought has been a more year-round business experience in the Yellowstone region. And this blue arrow represents the year that wolves were reintroduced in Yellowstone National Park. And then Grand Teton is Yellowstone's sister park to the south. They share a border. So almost, but not quite, of every visitor that comes to Yellowstone also passes through Grand Teton National Park, and they've just had a record year as well. Wildlife watching is also really huge in Grand Teton National Park, even though it's a smaller park. And a recent survey that I just read indicated that a lot of Europeans came to Grand Teton National Park, and I think the percentages were, I think 17% of the leading category of visitors was Canadian at 17%. And then I think 12% were from Great Britain, and 10% from Germany, and 10% from the Netherlands. So that was just a study that was done in Grand Teton National Park, but it's probably really similar in Yellowstone National Park. So lots of Northern Europeans like to come here. And so we'll get into a little bit here about the economic value of wolves in the Yellowstone region. And this was an advertisement for a wolf watching expedition that an organization that I've been working with, that my group was a part of, called the Western Wolf Coalition, and we formed about 4 years ago to try and build social tolerance and social carrying capacity, if you will, for wolves in the region because of the backlash that we saw happening against wolves. And so one of the things we did was organize this wolf watching expedition, and it wasn't. I'm not sure. You can't guarantee that people see the wolf, but we had really good guides and ecologists that did great, with good tracking skills and had great ecology talks. And this was an attempt to get something going outside of Yellowstone, like very far away in central Idaho, that other area where wolves were restored. So this is, there's only been a couple studies on this so far. This is a paper that it compared the economic value of hunting with wildlife watching in the region. And as you can see, as big as hunting is in the northern Rockies, particularly in Montana and Wyoming, the economic value and contribution just in these 5 counties in the Yellowstone area is far outpaced by wildlife viewing in terms of economic expenditures and revenue in those regions. And then another study that was recently done by an economist who is at the university where I live in Missoula, University of Montana. This was recently published, and they surveyed park visitors to Yellowstone on what animals they would most like to see when they come to the park. And here in 1991, when there probably weren't any wolves in the park, the wolf was all the way down here. And then a few years after the reintroduction of the wolf, it scored second in the ranking of animals most liked to see, and then increased again in 2005. So there's still more people that would like to see the grizzly bear, but the wolf is right up there. So it's really, some of these are really hard to see. Like you won't ever see a wolverine because there's so few of them, and they live at very high elevations. But in fact, since wolves have been restored to Yellowstone in recent years, almost 1 in 10 park visitors now actually gets to see a wolf, it's really quite amazing how successful it's been. Yellowstone Park Visitor Survey that Duffield did also indicated, they looked at, he asked the question, how has the restoration of the wolf actually contributed to the economy here in Yellowstone Park? So they surveyed several thousand visitors to the Yellowstone region and found out how many visitors said that the only reason they came to Yellowstone was because of the wolf. And they were able to figure out what percentage that was and how much economic value that added here to the area. And so based on these visitors' surveys, we found that the wolf had an economic value in 2005 of $35.5 million in terms of direct expenditures in these local communities surrounding Yellowstone National Park. But in fact, when they looked at the indirect economic effects from all that money being spent in terms of, if somebody buys a hotel room, then the hotel person has more money and he goes out to eat with his family at a local restaurant. And they estimated that the multiplier effect, that 35 million almost doubled in terms of indirect effects to the local economy. And once again, this is just in the counties of Wyoming and Idaho and Montana surrounding Yellowstone National Park, not to mention places further afield that maybe some of the visitors would go. And then the average expenditure per person here was about $375. And then another study took some data, and they looked at just the Yellowstone area, the percentage of people who actually hired a guide and hired an ecotourism, a wolf watch viewing outfitter to take them. And so they actually spent considerably more money, obviously, because they had to hire the outfitter. And the prices ranged from about $45 for a half-day wildlife viewing trip. And I think the price on the high end here, this $3,300, was for a week-long, a 7-day trip. And look at the number in terms of business development, look at the change in number of businesses offering wolf watching between 2000 and 2005. That's a huge increase, as well as the number of trips that were offered annually. So it's really been, I think this really says it a lot. The reintroduction of wolf has really catalyzed a lot of additional economic opportunity in this Yellowstone area. And these are just two gentlemen that I know that own two of the wolf viewing outfits around Yellowstone, and just some things that they've said that I think relate. In particular, I'm going to talk about what Ken said here about ecotourism should be a vehicle to promote conservation as well as economic diversity, as Franz also alluded to it during his presentation. So, you know, Ken, I was talking to Ken, the owner of that business, and he said he felt that it was important as he began doing wolf ecotourism and other wildlife that they develop basically some ethical principles to not just to keep people safe from the animals, because these are dangerous animals, but also to protect the animals and to respect them and to not unduly influence the animals. So some things that are totally not done is like putting food out to attract an animal. That's never ever done, and it's illegal probably in most places in the Yellowstone area, definitely within the park. And just being safe here. And so Ken actually came up with some guiding principles to guide his business, his wildlife viewing business, and that's, you know, probably if Sweden expands its wildlife viewing opportunities and ecotourism businesses, you'll probably want to develop some of your own ethics that fit in culturally for you. And so these are things that a lot of the visitors to Yellowstone are told when they come to Ken's operation here. So finally, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've learned in the last few years. And I guess one other thing I'll say too is one of the reasons, as I reflect about why wolves have brought so much additional economic value to a place like Yellowstone that was already a magnet. And I think it's because it's relatively easy to see a wolf compared to some of these other species, because wolves, by their nature, they're what are called coursing predators. They hunt out in the open, whereas some of these other animals like mountain lions and lynx are ambush predators. And so you can actually see wolves because they're hunting in the open, whereas the other animals can just hide somewhere. So that's pretty important. And then also just another thing to add about the visitor survey data is some of the businesses, it's been an average of about 8 to 10% growth per year in the Yellowstone area from the point of view of the wildlife viewing outfitters. So just learning about some of the things. I guess the first thing I'd say is the emotions and the politics around wolves really got out of control as those numbers climbed, and the backlash increased, and we in the environmental community didn't recognize that right off the bat and underestimated the power that the people who don't like wolves, mostly a small percentage of the hunting community, we underestimated how much political power they would amass, that they were able to go to Washington, D.C. and get protections for wolves restored. And part of it was probably our fault, because we insisted on keeping strong federal protections in place for wolves long after wolves were biologically recovered and had achieved biologically sound numbers in the park. And so they were able to accuse us of being anti-hunting and against hunting, which wasn't really true in general. But they were able to get a lot of political movement off of it. The other thing I'd recommend is, like I said, the media likes to focus on stories of conflict and blood, like when a wolf kills a sheep or a cattle. And so it's incumbent upon us who want to either promote the economic benefits or the ecological benefits of wolves and other carnivores. It's incumbent upon us to tell positive stories about wolves, to tell the stories of the economic benefit and the ecological role of large carnivores ourselves. Because the media doesn't always do that automatically. The ecotourism itself doesn't produce necessarily broad regional support for wolves in some constituencies, but it's definitely a story that's been undertold, in my opinion, and needs to be told more. Thirdly, If there's a way that and I understand that I think you have some of these conflicts in Sweden, but maybe not as intensely as we have felt in the Northern Rockies with the rural people who live in wolf country. If there's a way to work with them and help them remember how it's like to live in a place that has wolves, because the wolves were gone so long, I think a lot of the livestock producers, forgot what are the best practices for raising sheep and cattle in a place where there's large carnivores and wolves. And there's many tools. I have a brochure on the table over there. Unfortunately, there's just one copy on the table, but it goes through a lot of these techniques that ranchers can learn how to protect their livestock. And I encourage the environmental community in Sweden to work with those people rather than, get into this polarizing fight with them. From the point of view of the sportsmen and the hunters, I think there's also an even greater opportunity, particularly I'm thinking for hunting guides and outfitters, because after the hunting season ends, there's a great opportunity for wildlife viewing, and they already have the skills to to track wildlife and to find wildlife, and they could easily supplement their income from a hunting guide in the fall to a wildlife viewing guide in the winter. I think that's a great opportunity if you work with sportsmen, hunters, and hunting guides. And then finally, the other, in reflecting on a lot of the conflict we've had, particularly in the last few years, is, and this was questioned at the time, even by some environmental groups in the United States, is whether we should have actually reintroduced the wolves to Yellowstone because they were already on their way down from Canada. And, I still think we probably should have, but it is an interesting thing to consider. Would there have been less conflict if the wolves have come back on their own? Because then it would not have been seen as something the government did to the people. It would have been something that happened naturally. But I think as the next generation grows up, knowing that there's wolves around, I think there will be much less controversy, and people will now think of the Northern Rockies as a place where wolves are just a natural part of it. So there's my contact information, and thank you all very much, and to Ulf for hosting me. It's been a great opportunity to come to Sweden and talk to you all about our experience. So I look forward to answering any questions that I can. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goldman. Please come up here. I have some questions. Do you have anything to recommend when you talk about working together with the ranchers, the local people? What do you recommend?
Yeah, well, working in terms of how to protect their livestock, I think, is a big one, because it's been so long. It's been 100 years since there were wolves in the Northern Rockies, and a lot of the ranchers grew up without any wolves around, and they didn't have to worry about their livestock. And the practice that they got into was just turning their livestock loose, like I said, for the whole summer. But there's lots of techniques, such as having a rider on a horse or a ATV nowadays out there with the livestock, because wolves are very shy of people. And I also think that's a great opportunity in terms of ecotourism, and it's just now beginning to be explored in the region, where some guides are looking at the idea of working with a rancher to actually bring tourists onto the private land where there's cattle and do the ecotourism there, so that people can not only be seeing a wolf, but there's people around, and the landowner, the rancher, receives some economic value for having people there watching wild wolves as well.
And how do you cooperate with local entrepreneurs?
You mean, what do you mean? How do?
Well, all around, locals, ranchers develop the areas around, the enterprises around. Do you have any examples from the success in that area?
Well, it's just now. I just know of one instance where it's just now starting, and somebody who's been involved as a range rider, protecting livestock for years, is now working with other ranchers to explore this idea of bringing tourists onto the private land.
Okay, so you're just starting.
It's just starting. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Interesting. So,
Yeah.
and what challenges do you have just ahead?
Well, I think probably the biggest challenge is overcoming some of the misinformation about wolves. That the number one thing is that they're eating all the elk, which, as you can see from my presentation, the data does not back that argument up. But it's still a challenge, because it's still out there. And then the other challenge is that they're eating all the livestock. And that's not true either. And I'd say those are the two biggest challenges, because the goal, the big thing we want to do is build this social support, the social carrying capacity for wolves in these rural areas. There's a lot of support for wolves, you know, in places where people don't live with the wolves, like in the urban areas, but it's really important that the rural people that are on the ground also support having the wolves there. And I think that's one place where ecotourism and wildlife viewing can really help provide that extra economic incentive.
It's also one of the issues here. Do we have any questions in the audience? Or, yeah, sure, you're welcome. Who are you?
I'm Kalle Thulin from Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, SLU in Sweden. Thank you for a very good talk and very good advice, I think. I was thinking you made a comparison of hunting tourism and wildlife tourism in this particular area around the Yellowstone. How would those match economically on a national scale in the US? Have you any ideas about numbers?
You know, I don't. That was just the one study done in Yellowstone, but nationally, there's the national average of people in the United States who actually hunt is much, much lower than the people who view wildlife. It's, you know, as you could see, wildlife viewing is something that, you know, I think the data was something like 1/3 of Americans engages in some form of it. In my state, in Montana, we have the highest percentage of people who hunt of any state in the U.S., and it's still only 19%. So I think in most areas of the country, the data would show really similar results, where wildlife viewing would be much more valuable economically than hunting. You know, it's not to say we shouldn't have hunting, but it's just another piece of the, yeah. I think it would be the same.
Yellowstone is particularly, I mean, it's a special place in many ways. But
Yeah. But it's also a place that attracts lots of hunting, so, yeah.
So, we have another question. Just please state who you are also. Thank you.
Do you hear me now? Okay, it works. Have you seen any changes in terms of conservation and preservation or developments?
Do you mean as a result of the wolves, or?
Yes, particularly, and the development of different kind of ecotourism.
Oh, in terms of ecotourism? Yeah, mostly I think there certainly has been more. I think clearly there's more businesses that are involved in wildlife ecotourism now than there were before the wolf came back. And I'm not sure why, but the wolf, it's really a magnet species, both for people who love carnivores and for people who don't love them. For people who don't like animals, I think it's really or not don't like animals, but people who are against carnivores, I think the wolf, you know, it's more of a cultural thing. For so long we've heard these fairy tales about the Three Little Pigs and Little Red Riding Hood. Do you have those stories here? Yeah, and the wolf is always this bad guy. And I think because people don't feel the same way about bears. It's really strange to me, but the wolf just draws the anger out of some people. And on the other hand, I think because of our affinity for dogs generally, like people who love carnivores really love the wolf. And I think that's why it's really helped ecotourism in the Yellowstone area, having that wolf back.
Okay. Now it's 10:30, and we all want a cup of coffee. Thank you
Yeah,
so
me too.
much, Mr. Goldman. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.